So originally this video was going to be about how I got back into One Piece after watching the live-action show on Netflix, and serve as my sort of review of the East Blue arc, which I have only just recently finished as of recording this. I'm a couple of chapters past that now, finishing up the Logetown arc. But as I began to gather my thoughts for what I wanted this video to be, a narrative began to emerge that to me was much more interesting than writing the internet's 500th millionth One Piece retrospective. So with that in mind, this is not a review of One Piece. This is more a story about me, about my journey as an anime fan, and how One Piece has factored into that at various points in my life. So, let's talk. Where I begin my story is a place that is not dissimilar to a lot of people who grew up in the late 90s and 2000s. I was a kid who liked watching cartoons. I liked watching all sorts of cartoons, from, the more American-style cartoons, to some of the earliest anime that ever really got, massive success in America. That isn't to say I was part of the original boom of watching shows like Ninja Scroll and stuff like that, but more stuff like Dragon Ball Z and Pokemon was obviously a big one, and for me the biggest was always Yu-Gi-Oh! I was a big fan of all of these shows, and I guess naturally that led to the point when I was browsing in my local Barnes & Noble one day and saw must have been issue 5, I think, of Shonen Jump. It was one that had Yugi on the cover, and it was Yugi and a big-ass picture of a Blue Eyes White Dragon. And seeing this and seeing some of the other stuff that was advertising, I caught my eye, and I picked that magazine up, and I read that sucker cover to cover. Obviously, the first thing I went towards was Yu-Gi-Oh! And one day I would love to talk about how Yu-Gi-Oh! Is one of my favorite franchises ever, but that is not what I'm here to discuss with you today. What I am here to talk about is another new story that I found between those pages, a quirky little tale about a plucky guy named Luffy, or as I thought back then, Luffy, who wanted to be the king of the pirates. Yes, One Piece was a manga that really caught my eye when I first read it. I don't remember what chapter it must have been on. It was obviously one of the very early stories, but it was something that I found really interesting. Obviously, I don't even think I was in the double digits at this point, so this was one of the first animated shows I'd seen that really was like, I had seen Dragon Ball up to that point, but I don't think I'd really absorbed a lot of the darkness and violence that was more inherent in those shows. But when you read One Piece and you see, there's blood in that. And I mean, One Piece wasn't the only one to do that. There was manga like Naruto in there as well. And I think this, for me, for so many other people of my era, was what really set me on the path to being the larval form of a weeaboo. And from that point on, I would get every new issue of Shonen Jump as they came out. I would eventually subscribe. I loved these stories. And, I'm not going to lie for the sake of the video and say that One Piece was my favorite out of all of them. But I do want to focus on that because it is relevant to this specific video. One Piece was an enjoyable story for me, and I loved seeing where the story would go month to month. I loved seeing the Straw Hat crew slowly grow from a funny rubber man named Monkey to a cool badass swordsman who, no matter how much time passes, will always be Zolo to me. A sly lady thief who, it's really weird that was the way I described her. I think the 4Kids rap is still poisoning my mind. A coward with a heart of gold, and anime Johnny Bravo. I loved seeing the complex battles that would unfold with every new chapter, with people with interesting powers and abilities and backstories. One Piece was a really cool manga. And around the time that the original crew came together with the ending of the Arlong Park arc, that's actually one of the last things I really remember from reading One Piece back in the day, because it was around then that things in my life started to get weird. Specifically, my school life. I've never been popular. It was never really one of the cool kids at school. I grew up in a small South Texas town, and whatever anime was in a small Texas town in the mid to late 2000s, cool is not the word I would use to describe it. If there was a word I would use to describe the boys at that time, it would be cruel. Obviously, anybody who was not, down with what I don't want to say the popular kids, because I don't know, thinking back on it, that our school really had anyone who was popular. But we definitely had people who were unpopular, and I was definitely one of them. I was one of those guys who was still into a lot of stuff that is considered babyish for kids, or, if you want to use the proper terminology from back then, gay. The worst thing that you could be called in a small Texas town in the mid to late 2000s. And, obviously, when the tides of school society start to turn that way, different kids have different reactions. And the kids I envied, and those that I still envy, were the ones who would take it all in stride, who would recognize that people were making fun of them for the things they enjoyed, and sort of just say, who cares? It makes me happy. Like, at the end of the day, what does it matter? I was not one of those kids. No, around the time in my life that this all happened, I decided that the logical answer to not being accepted by my peers was to try and step away from everything that had made me happy if it was something that could be considered childish. So I stopped playing Pokemon games, I stopped regularly picking up Shonen Jump, stopped watching anime, and I tried to get into more mainstream pursuits. I tried getting into music. I've never really been somebody who was really into music, which is a weird thing to say. I mean, I've got music that I like, but it's just never been a hobby for me. I tried getting into games like Call of Duty, because that's what all the cool kids were playing. And God help me, for a little while there, I even tried playing sports. It probably wouldn't surprise you if I were to then tell you that these were some of the most miserable years of my life. Later on, I would come to discover that I was depressed. And when I say later on, I think I was in college when it was pointed out to me. And if I really started to trace the wire back to the wall with that, I think a lot of my first experiences with really not feeling happy about who I was and just sort of feeling down was the moment where I realized that a significant amount of my peers disliked me, some of them hated me, and that when faced with this information, my response was to eliminate my primary sources of happiness in a desperate bid to be accepted. I'm going to put a link below in the info box for this video to a video that my friend Jett made, which, I'm sorry Jett, I'm going to spoil right now, ultimately goes into a deep discussion about the desire to be seen as grown up and the paradox of how being seen as grown up is something that is largely the concern of children. And I agree with pretty much all of that. But hey, hindsight's 20/20. Those years are not what I'm here to discuss. I'm not going to go in depth, but I'm sure that there's at least a few of you out there who went down the same route I did and understand exactly how much that sucks. And it wasn't until maybe my junior year of high school that things slowly started to change in my mind. And it was a slow process. I think one of the first big ones was that I was part of my school's forensics team. And it was on one of our trips to compete in debate that one of my closest friends, and a good friend still to this day, informed me that he had begun hanging out with some of the kids from one of the other schools who was there, and that those kids were all playing Yu-Gi-Oh!, a franchise that I was shocked to learn was, still around. And I thought to myself, you know what? I used to really enjoy Yu-Gi-Oh! My friend's getting into Yu-Gi-Oh! Why not? Why do I care so much? So I got back into Yu-Gi-Oh! And that was like the first crack forming on this cocoon that I had put myself in. Now, As time went on, more and more cracks began to form in that shell. It was little things. I would start allowing myself to enjoy playing Pokemon again. And, oh boy, a big one was definitely when the My Little Pony fandom really started kicking up, the genesis of the bronies. And yes, I am sorry to disappoint you, dear viewer, but I was one of the original bronies, and I was probably every bit as obnoxious as you are imagining I was. That time in my life is definitely behind me. I still think that the first 2 or so seasons of My Little Pony Friendship is Magic are some of the best animation produced in America. But that is neither here nor there. Because you see, it wasn't until I graduated high school that I really started to try getting back into anime. I went with a couple of friends of mine to my first anime convention shortly after graduating high school, for obviously reasons unrelated to anime. Unfortunately, I was also into Homestuck at the time because of one of those same friends, and it was there at that convention that I remembered how much I used to love anime. And so, around that time, I began dipping my toes back in. One of the big shows that I started watching around that time was Dead Man Wonderland, which was currently airing, and it became one of my favorite anime. I still love it. I think it's a really cool concept for a show, and one of these days I am going to go back and finish the manga. But I remember at the time learning that Naruto, One Piece, and a lot of the shows that I had grown up reading in Shonen Jump were actually still going. And I thought to myself, wow, I did love those shows, but they're far too long for me to ever bother trying to catch up with. As I went through college, I made a bit of a support system of friends, people who were good to me, were way better to me than I would say 90% of the people in the school that I grew up in that small town. And these friends helped me to remember just this pure, unbridled joy of liking things and not being ashamed for them. And it was nice. And as time went on, I slowly readopted just about every fandom I had ever been a part of, except for those big ones. And when I eventually graduated college in 2016, me and my family went to Japan. It was my very first trip to Japan. It is still one of my most treasured memories. And the thing that sticks out most to me is I remember a moment being on the subway in Japan and looking over and seeing a Japanese businessman who was sitting there reading a Shonen Jump. And in the window behind him, I could see the reflection of whatever the most recent chapter of One Piece was. And I remember looking at that and just getting really wistful and remembering all of the good times I had reading One Piece back then and how much I enjoyed it. And I remember wanting to be able to go back and to follow those adventures. But again, One Piece was way too big. It was way too long. It was something that other people could get into because they had been following it all their lives. But it wasn't something that I could see myself going back to. And then we got the announcement that One Piece was getting a live-action adaptation to be produced by Netflix. The same people who had brought us Death Note starring Willem Dafoe, one of the greatest cinematic achievements of our lifetime. Now, to be honest, I'm probably much more forgiving than most when it comes to live-action anime adaptations. I know for a lot of people, the very concept of a live-action anime adaptation is sacrilegious. A lot of people would say just go watch the anime or go read the manga. But I do think there's room for these things. I mean, hell, I really enjoyed the JoJo live-action. I thought that it was really cool. And when the casting was announced for the One Piece live-action, I saw them and I thought, yeah, I could see these guys in these roles from what I remembered. I could see this working. And then the photos from the set came out, and we could see these incredible ships that were like practical sets. And I'm not gonna lie, I had this sort of moment where I was like, oh man, I remember this. One Piece was actually really cool. I kind of want to watch this. And then that first trailer dropped. And man, it all started coming back. I I was like, damn, I really liked One Piece, and this looks great. And I remember the opinion on the internet at the time was definitely split. There were some people who thought it looked great. There were some people who did not agree with that. But I was looking forward to it. And then fast forward once more to the day that the show dropped. It was actually the same day that I was meeting up with some friends of mine to go to the San Japan Anime Convention in San Antonio, Texas. And I remember being in that hotel room with all of my friends after a long day on the con floor, sitting down and watching the first episode. And even my wife, who was sitting next to me, who never liked One Piece, was getting into it. And I was sharing this moment with all of my friends who had been following One Piece, and I could see the joy on their faces. I could see the excitement with which they were discussing the various aspects of the adaptation. And in that moment, I think it was in that moment I decided, damn, I'm gonna have to go back and get into One Piece, aren't I? And then I saw a Yamato cosplayer the next day on the convention floor and decided, yep, I'm reading One Piece. So we eventually managed to get through the entire series, and I really enjoyed it. And I told myself, alright, if I'm gonna do this, I'm not gonna watch the anime because that shit is way too long. So I decided to go on Amazon and look at those manga collections that I had always stared at with this just incredible asexual lust. Something about a huge box that is just full of the collected volumes of a comic book. It's an incredible visual treat to me, and I had always kind of wanted to get one for myself, but very few series that I had ever been interested in were released as a box set. It was mostly a lot of Shonen Jump stuff, so I said screw it. And when I saw one of the box sets for the East Blue arc on Amazon for a little over $100, which was a major markdown from the MSRP of almost $200, I hit order and I had it sent to me. And since then, I have basically forced myself to read at least one chapter a day, more when I can, and as I said at the top of this video, I have recently managed to get to the end of the Arlong Park arc. I have finished Logtown, and just now I am getting to the point where the gang has hit Reverse Island and are heading towards the Grand Line. And this is all probably gonna sound really cheesy, but reading through this manga now, as an adult, 20 some odd years later, it's felt like getting to reconnect with a dear old friend. Someone who I literally haven't seen in decades. And just picking up and talking with them, reminiscing on the good times, and learning about what they've been up to in the years since. And as I read through the chapters showing their approach to the Grand Line, and I saw that moment where Luffy, Zoro, Nami, Usopp, and Sanji all come together and state their various dreams as they head towards the Grand Line. It almost feels like I'm fulfilling a promise to that old friend. A promise that we made when we were children. That we would one day find the Grand Line and find the One Piece. And because the manga is not quite over yet, I get to be a part of that journey now. And it seems stupid, even saying this, but I don't think I could have ever realized how much that means to me. So, as I said at the beginning of this video, this is not a review of One Piece. This is a story about me and someone I used to know when I was young, and what it's been like for us to finally catch up now that we're both adults. So with all that said, this has been a powerfully pointless video, but I hope you enjoyed it anyways. Alright, so that is another video down. I was not sure about this one, and even as I sit here finishing the recording, I'm really not sure about this one. But, I don't know. As I said, I wanted to give my thoughts on what it's like to come back to One Piece all these decades later. And, eventually I realized that this was the story I wanted to tell. And I just want to say thank you for the massive response to my last video on Five Nights at Freddy's. It is really helping with the motivation to continue making videos, and we'll see if this one can do just as well. Maybe even better. Well, I guess only time is going to tell. So, I have stolen over 25 minutes of your time at this point, and I think I'll let you get back to the rest of your day now. So, take care.